Bien, buenos días a todos, estimadas autoridades, vicerrector, autoridades civiles y militares. Vamos a hacer un breve acto de presentación del seminario Geopolítica of Natural Gas in the European Union, the Old Soviet Bloc and Russia, Energy and Geopolitics, Policy of Energy. Nosotros vamos a hacer la presentación en español, aunque luego, como había sido anunciado, el seminario va a ser en lengua inglesa. Me corresponde a mí tener el honor de moderar esta mesa inaugural de la actividad organizada por el profesor San Martín, a quien le doy las gracias por haber organizado esta actividad y haber contado con el decanato de la facultad para participar en esta inauguración. Y le voy a dar la palabra a Nicole Callaghan, que es funcionaria de Diplomacia Pública de la Embajada de Estados Unidos, a quien ha soportado también y ha ayudado a la organización de este acto. Es la primera vez en la que la Universidad de Alicante, la Facultad de Derecho, colabora con la Embajada de Estados Unidos. Le doy las gracias por tenernos en cuenta y espero que sea la primera de varias presencias suyas en nuestra Facultad de Derecho. Tienen la palabra.
Hi, and thank you. Welcome, and thank you for attending this important lecture. This is part of a program that the U.S. Embassy partners with esglobal on, called Defensa y Yo, where we bring in various experts and speakers to Spanish universities, 16 Spanish universities this year, and so we're very happy to partner with the University of Alicante, and thank you, Professor San Martin, for being such a good partner with us. And really the goal of this program is to create a culture of security and defense among Spain's next leaders, and bringing a very sort of wide range of views and different topics that are relevant to the security and defense world. And clearly this year especially, energy is incredibly important to the security and defense world. So I thank you so much for being part of this and partnering with us here.
Thank you very much. A continuación, también que me acompaña en esta mesa, le voy a dar la palabra a Marta Guzmán, que es responsable de comunicación de esglobal. También es la primera vez que, a través del profesor San Martín, esglobal trabaja con la Facultad de Derecho y, bueno, pues ya he tenido oportunidad de hablar con ella y le reitero en público lo mismo que le he reiterado en privado. Espero que esta sea el inicio de una colaboración entre esglobal y la Facultad de Derecho de la Universidad de Alicante. Marta, cuando quieras.
Muchas gracias, vicedecano. También muchas gracias a la Universidad de Alicante, al profesor José San Martín por toda la colaboración y toda la ayuda en la organización de este evento, a la Embajada de Estados Unidos y también a nuestra excelente ponente, Anna Mikulska. Bueno, nosotros esglobal somos actualmente un medio digital. Anteriormente éramos Foreign Policy en español, que también éramos una revista física. Y llevamos ya 3 ediciones colaborando con la Embajada de Estados Unidos en este programa Defensa y Yo, que lo que busca es promover también el diálogo entre la juventud y promover también la cultura de la defensa en medio, pues, de la nueva generación de jóvenes. También, pues, a través de este programa os animo, si no lo sabéis, a que participéis en el concurso. Es un concurso que está abierto a las 16 universidades participantes y habrá un ganador por universidad. El concurso consiste en la presentación de una redacción, un podcast, un vídeo, un recurso visual relacionado con el tema que vayamos a tratar hoy, de la geopolítica de la energía. Tenéis las bases y todas las instrucciones y la información en nuestra web. Podéis consultarlas después. Y el premio para aquellos ganadores seleccionados será un viaje a Bruselas para conocer la sede de la OTAN, también una base aérea militar, y podréis también tener conversaciones muy interesantes con diplomáticos, personal político y militar también allí de la Embajada de Estados Unidos, de la representación española ante la OTAN y demás. Así que os animo de verdad a llevar a cabo esta candidatura al concurso, y también os doy muchas gracias por asistir a este seminario.
Bien, muchas gracias, Marta. Bueno, me toca a mí, en representación del decano, pues dirigirles unas palabras para clausurar un seminario que simplemente con el título pues es fácilmente entendible la actualidad y la relevancia del tema. Es cierto que, por desgracia, esta relevancia de las cuestiones energéticas ha adquirido una renovada dimensión como consecuencia de la invasión de Rusia a la Federación de Ucrania. Sin embargo, Yo creo que las cuestiones de la energía, la ponente nos hablará de ello, persisten y van a trascender al conflicto de Ucrania. Es así, y sobre todo en los países de la Unión Europea que somos pues dependientes energéticamente de terceros estados. La cuestión del gas se ve muy clara. Aquellos que me conocen saben que yo soy profesor de Derecho Internacional Público y me ha siempre gustado mucho las cuestiones de la energía, porque creo que están íntimamente conectadas con otras muchas facetas. Si un simple vistazo a los datos nos lleva a comprobar la relevancia que tiene el tema. Si nos vamos a quién compraba, sin querer adentrarme en el terreno de la conferencia, si echamos un vistazo a quién compraba la Unión Europea el gas ruso, nos damos cuenta de la importancia que esto tiene. El 41,1% del gas que importaba la Unión Europea antes del conflicto ruso venía de la Federación Rusa. El 16,2% provenía de Noruega, el 7,6% de Argelia, el 5,2% de Qatar y el 29,9% de otros estados, varios estados. Evidentemente, todo esto se encuentra en un proceso de reestructuración en el que la ponente seguro que nos indica dónde va a llegar. Es cierto que la situación de España en este caso era o es y continúa siendo bastante peculiar, porque nuestra dependencia energética de Rusia era considerablemente menor. Por ejemplo, en materia del gas solamente importábamos el 8,7% de nuestro gas era procedente de la Federación Rusa, pero sin duda es un tema de gran relevancia, es un tema que va a estar ahí para los próximos años y que sin duda nuestra ponente nos va a arrojar luz sobre estas cuestiones. For the School of Law, it's a true honor to have a speaker to the prestige of Professor Mikulska, who I thank for her presence at the School of Law, University of Alicante. Sin más, Professor San Martín, take the floor for the introduction to the speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vice Dean. Vice Rector, Dean, Vice Dean, Admiral, Comandante, autoridades civiles y militares, señoras y señores. Thank you for coming here. The University of Alicante is proud to carry out this important seminar on geopolitics of energy in cooperation with the United States Embassy. Thank you to Ambassador Julissa Reynoso. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, esglobal. Thank you, Beatriz and Marta. And thank you also our Faculty of Law. Thank you to the Institute for International Economy, the area of Political Science, and Radius Intelligentsia. Thank you so much to all of them. A special thanks to the Dean of the Faculty of Law and his team for their help and cooperation. This is the start of an institutional collaboration that has an extraordinary potential for both Spain and America. The University of Alicante will be the right tool to implement and develop the best of our two countries. As you can see, American friends, this is the best land in the world, Alicante, la millor terra del món. Thank you also to Professor Mikulska, a prestigious expert in energy and geopolitics, both, for this lecture here today. This university is from now on also your university, Professor Mikulska. Welcome to your new university, forever. Absolutely. Thank you to the people meet here coming from distinct and distinguished sectors, university students and professors, businessmen, company leaders, senior intelligence, army, and navy officers, diplomats, between others. Now, time to introduce the speaker, this great, extraordinary speaker, brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Professor Mikulska is a fellow in energy studies at the Center for Energy Studies at Rice University Baker Institute for Public Policy in the United States. Her research focuses on the geopolitics of natural gas within the European Union, former Soviet bloc, and Russia. Her current interests include the potential use of natural gas as a geoeconomic tool and to reinforce the European energy security, very important today. Mikulska is a senior fellow at University of Pennsylvania Kleinman Center for Energy Policy, where she teaches graduate-level courses, seminars on energy policy and geopolitics of energy. She is also a fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and sits on the editorial board of the Anna Mikulska University Law Review. She is Polish and American, both nationalities. Really? Mikulska speaks Polish, English, German, Farsi, Russian, and probably...
Now I'll have to speak Spanish. Because this is my university.
With time. I think
with time. Yes.
Some weeks.
And Catalan, both, I'm assuming, right?
First of all, Spanish. A little Catalan. She received a law degree from Anna Mikulska University, a master's degree in international relations from the University of Windsor in Canada, and a doctorate, PhD, in political science from the University of Houston. Professor Mikulska, please, it's your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this amazing welcome and introduction, Professor San Martin. It's my pleasure to be here. I really appreciate the embassy, U.S. Embassy, for inviting me here, and you for coming to listen to what I've been looking at for actually years, but with a much more focus over the last year, since February 24, 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine. Although, as you'll see through the lecture, through the presentation, actually the work on the invasion really started before 2022 on the part of Russia, as it prepared to use energy as a geopolitical weapon, or as a weapon really, and impact Europe, not only Ukraine, but also Europe. So kind of quickly talking about what is geopolitics. We hear it all the time in the news, in probably in your lecture, geopolitics, but what really is it? And how it relates to energy. So geopolitics is a political aspect of something, and in that case is of energy, and that's linked to supply and demand. So we could think of Middle East or OPEC for oil, and Russia for natural gas, especially in Europe, where the dependencies that exist could be exploited not only for commercial reasons or economic reasons, which they often are, but also for political reasons. So a country or a cartel, like the way that OPEC is, might want another country to do something or not to do something in their own political realm. And by that, it encourages that country with using energy resources that the other country might not have and might depend on. So geopolitics always comes to attention at moment of crisis, when there is an inelastic supply and demand. So basically, when there's just not enough of energy to come along, so the countries that have it, that develop energy, that export it, are in a stronger position. It's often related to very huge, massive price fluctuations, and I think if you live here in Europe, you've been experiencing these. Political power is usually in the hands of exporters. That being said, if you're a large demand center, you also could exert geopolitical power on energy exporters. And we can think about different types of embargoes or sanctions that are being put on different countries with respect to energy. Think Venezuela, Iran, Russia, nowadays in particular, where this is way in which geopolitically or geoeconomically as well, we try to influence a country behavior. And Russia has used demand for its own demand for energy as a geopolitical tool, as it often actually imports gas or oil from countries in Central Asia for the sole reason to make those countries dependent on it, because it's obviously Russia does not need that gas or oil for its own economy. It has quite a lot. The geopolitics of energy, it's never steady, right? It's changed. It has changed. It has changed very much by the entrance of the U.S. oil and gas producers as a result of shale revolution. And we can talk about it in Q&A. What happened, how it came to be. But it's important to underscore that the U.S. state doesn't own oil and gas that is produced within the U.S. This is produced and owned by private companies, and these companies sell oil and gas on regular market. So as opposed to, for example, Russia or Qatar or Saudi Arabia or so on, where state really is behind production and behind sales because the companies, the oil and gas companies are owned by state or at the very least are controlled by state. In the U.S., that's not the case. So in the U.S., the market forces will prevail in terms of when and how and at what price the oil and gas is going to be sold. In countries where energy is controlled by state, we have to be cognizant that the sale of energy might not necessarily be related to the environment, to the economic environment. It will be related to the policy. And that's where the issues begin, because I often actually hear how markets are not predictable. Well, they kind of are. And we have economists in the room, so maybe they will tell now. But they kind of are, because we know what happens when there is a lot of supply and low demand and the opposite and so on. So we at the very least we can figure out the way that market will move or how will different changes affect that market. This is not the case in terms of many countries. Policies can be fickle, in particular in countries that are autocratic. And I'd be first to admit, I did not think that Russia would invade Ukraine. And in fact, most of my colleagues, also in the Russian and East European Studies Department, they did not believe that it would happen. 3 days before the invasion, I was like, there's no way, this makes no sense. Well, the rationalities of our world, often the Western world, democratic world, are very different than the rationalities of Vladimir Putin. And different goals, will actually suggest different solutions. Climate change action and decarbonization is another one that comes into the realm of geopolitics. How things are arranged, which countries use which type of energy, how we encourage countries to use specific types of energy, or how we discourage them from using others. And of course, Russian invasion on Ukraine has really changed the setup of energy, geopolitics, and really brought geopolitics to the front of everybody's mind, particularly as it relates to energy security. But before I go to defining what energy security kind of is and how it relates to geopolitics, I wanted to kind of really make sure that everybody sees how it relates not only to economic well-being, but also to national security. And actually, the U.S. Bureau of Energy Resources has specified, in particular, that U.S. national security is threatened when our allies lack reliable access to affordable energy or diversity of choices. I mean, there is an obvious connection here, right, to what's happening. When foreign markets, energy markets shut out U.S. companies, where poor governance prevents market-based energy solutions, when competition for energy leads to conflict, or terrorists and rogue regimes seek to exploit energy resources to find violence and destabilizing activities. And all these aspects where energy is part of the picture, are also impacting U.S. national security. But if you think about any other country, really, they do impact national security of each country. We all use energy all over the world to lesser or higher extent, but this is something that's crucial for us to live, develop, make sure that countries and their populations are doing well. So the easiest way in which you can define energy security is to have sufficient supply of energy at reasonable price. Right? That has not been the case in Europe. Right? How it relates to geopolitics? Well, if you have access to affordable energy resources, but you don't have to be unduly contorted by political, security, diplomatic, or military arrangements. So that's, as I've mentioned at the very beginning, that's when geopolitics come in and where energy meets international politics. I really like the definition of energy security as kind of this 4 A's idea or setup. It's just easy to remember, and it's so nice to apply as you go through, particularly where you go through the current issues in Europe. So it's this availability, affordability, accessibility, and acceptability. And unfortunately, in every single aspect, Europe failed over the last year. Every single one aspect had to be redefined and had to be addressed. And I will talk about this as we go through different issues and how it relates. But before I focus on natural gas, but I wanted to kind of also say why do I focus on natural gas when I look at geopolitics of energy in Russia and Eurasia much more than I ever look at oil. They're two different resources, but the way they are set up, it kind of makes use of natural gas a better geopolitical tool. It's much more difficult nowadays to use oil as geopolitical tool. And that's also because in 1970s, OPEC has used oil as geopolitical tool. And countries adjusted. We now have strategic reserves that are mandated across the International Energy Agency countries. And so we have that, and oil market has become much more open, much deeper, meaning there's more suppliers. And in particular, we also have actually the U.S. suppliers, and which entrance of which have really changed and really had an impact on the way that the oil world works. So it diversified, obviously it diversified suppliers, but as I said, U.S. oil has provided the world not with one supplier. It provided the world with hundreds of suppliers that work as individual companies. So that's, again, the more diversity. U.S. is more stable politically. A lot of countries that produce oil actually are not stable politically. So we would be impacted by outages in countries like Libya, Iran, Iraq, and Venezuela. So this actually having a stable supplier, providing access to oil and directed by economic kind of laws, that's actually quite valuable. Regulates the market, makes it more stable. Shale is also less prone to political interference and expropriation. And that's because of how it's actually being developed. You have to keep drilling. It's this drill, baby, drill type of slogan that you can hear in Texas. And I lived in Texas for 11 years. So you really, when you produce from shale, you have to drill the well, and the well produces for several months only at a high level. So in order to keep the same level of production, you have to drill another well and another well and another well. You can access oil really quickly, but you have to keep drilling. So there's a lot of, it's a very intensive type of production. And U.S. itself is exposed less to geopolitical risk. Now, U.S. used to be exported before 70s. Later on, there was a ban on export of oil in the U.S. that was actually waived in 2014 by President Obama. And the reason for it was because now U.S. actually were able to act, was producing more than it needed. It was producing also different type of oil, but in it really kind of opened the markets, but it also influences the geopolitical power of other countries that produce, particularly state producers, OPEC. And as a matter of fact, OPEC has taken notice. It's taken notice because it has become much more difficult for OPEC to influence prices of oil globally. Because as soon as OPEC would stop producing to create, the shortage of supply and higher prices, well, that was a great signal for all these commercially minded producers in the U.S. Because what you do, you drill because the oil is so expensive that you make a lot of money. So drill, baby, drill. You quickly are able to quickly activate additional oil supply, and this goes in the market. And OPEC struck twice, and they struck out both times. They were not able to control the market. Now, what they did, they added Russia to the mix. So now we're not actually talking only about OPEC. We're talking about OPEC plus. And Russia is part of the system, which helps OPEC somewhat to regulate prices because it added a lot of additional supply, so a bigger market value of that. But it's still, we haven't seen this huge fluctuation. And in fact, if you think about what's happened over the last year, oil hasn't been as impacted in terms of prices. We haven't seen $150 or $200 per barrel for oil. We haven't seen the rises of prices that we've seen for natural gas or electricity, which is related because gas is used for that. So crude oil has become less, not completely, but less geopolitically laden, and it's easier to control, including. But why? Because also it's easy to move it around, relatively easy. It's easier to move around coal, but more countries have it domestically, and easier to store coal. But still, compared to natural gas, oil is much easier to transport. You just load it on a tanker, take it to other port. That's not the case of natural gas. So natural gas traditionally has been a regional fuel. And I mean, Europe is the best example, right? It's really what you see is these pipelines that bring this natural gas from point A to point B, and that's from Russia to Europe, right? And that kind of started that connection started in the 1960s when Austria, Germany have been working with Russia to set up a system of delivery. Well, why? Because the Russian gas sector actually felt left out. So it became this weird kind of situation where under Cold War conditions, Russia's gas sector was working with the German utilities and German government and Austrian government and setting up a delivery system for natural gas. This really kind of got sped up in 1973 because Europe used to heat houses mostly with fuel oil. Well, 1973, you see embargo. OPEC puts embargo on U.S., cuts deliveries of oil to Europe and progressively, and Europe thinks, whoa, we are geopolitically exposed. Let's get rid of this use of that oil, and let's use Russian gas. Well, that didn't work well, although for a while it did, and that's kind of really what was happening. And now Russian gas industry was kind of the less loved child of the Russian government. Oil was more loved because oil was always bringing more money. So there was not enough money to go around, not enough pipeline material to go around, steel, and most of it was used by oil industry, and the natural gas industry was left out. And so natural gas industry said, Europe, see what's happening with OPEC. We can send you gas. Let's barter. And truthfully, Europe provided steel and pipes and technology, and Russia provided gas, and that's how kind of this trade began. And there has been no break to Russian gas deliveries to Europe over the Cold War period, partially because both sides really needed each other. Right? That was very important for both. But it also created a lot of trust between those two parts. So especially when you think about Russia and Germany, which kind of explains what happened in Germany, that it wasn't really just a fluke or whatever else. There has been a lot of trust developed over the Cold War period, where Russia kept developing, sending gas despite huge differences, of course, between the two. And the utilities have been connected. Ruhrgas and Gazprom, they would have their own trainings and so on. So it was very difficult in the German mind to kind of think of Russia otherwise. And in fact, Germany thought, according to what they called Ostpolitics, so Ostpolitik, which is basically the politics of the East, that they are the ones that influencing Russia. They tying in Russia economically, so it would make no sense for Russia to become aggressive. Well, that kind of didn't, as we all see, work out. But what also happened, Europe has really moved to natural gas. What happened is, though, natural gas started being developed more globally because of increase of LNG trade. LNG has been around for decades, but it was very expensive and it was only delivered where countries really had no other choice. So, you cannot, it's very difficult to bring a pipeline to Japan or Korea, right? South Korea. So you end up with LNG. But the liquefaction technology became cheaper and the market started moving around. A lot of new entrants came in, and including US, Australia. Again, think about this geopolitical aspect of that. You have two stable countries, democracies, working on the basis of commercial and not political. That makes a difference in the market. Very similar trend, but it's just more difficult to set it up. Partially because of what I was mentioning. You just need a lot of very expensive infrastructure to be able to move gas globally as LNG. And Europe, of course, is learning this the hard way. In particular, Germany, which have been setting up hastily, all those floating LNG terminals in Brunsbüttel, Wilhelmshaven, and Lubmin, and on the other, these are millions of dollars. Well, the infrastructure for exports, the liquefaction infrastructure, is billions and billions of dollars. Extremely expensive. Takes time to be permitted, and then takes time to build. So if you already permitted, which can take several years, then you have to still. In case of the U.S. Companies, you have to still find financing. So you have to, before you get financing, you have to find contracts. That's something that Europe has to think about now. Well, do we help the American LNG and actually contract so that the ones that are being planned, permitted, can have a chance of getting out? And then it takes around 3-4 years to be built. So that's why we know at this moment how much LNG there's going to be available globally this year and next year and the year after. Because we know that nothing else is going to make it, or we know which LNG export facilities are being built. In fact, there is zero new LNG supply coming this year, in addition to what's already exists. The only new supply is not really new. It's the Freeport LNG that had a fire and wasn't working since June, but it's coming back online. But it's not new. That was there already. Very little is coming in 2024, 2025. Most of it actually from the U.S. and 2026. Where we will see the movement because Qatar's new development from the North Field is going to enter market. So we will see a little bit better conditions then. Just trying to put this in perspective. Where was Europe before the war in Ukraine? Again, with petroleum oil, if you see, Russia is a big part of it, but there's a lot of other producers. Again, liquid market. That's why Europe was able to basically sanction oil, because that oil has moved somewhere else, and other providers have been providing for oil in Europe. Gas, Russia has much bigger part of the European market. And again, because Russia has this point A to point B connection, it's it's just there, and there has not been enough other infrastructure to bring it, and that's where we come to the access to the availability of gas, right? So the first A of the energy security equation. Once of a sudden, the gas that was coming from Russia stops, and that means that the availability is not there. Right? It's once of a sudden Europe is faced with the issue that either gas is flowing but they cannot count on it, or it's not flowing anymore. And we've seen this on the part of doing this on the part of Russia. Well, first of all, Russia cut down on supplies via Ukraine. Under different circumstances, it's in Russia. With Russia, it's never we will stop sending gas unless you do this, this, and this. No, there's always a technical difficulty, right, or explosion on the pipeline or pipelines. So it's always something that they will kind of point to. It always happens at the least convenient moment, like end of a cold winter where storage is not working, but you still have several cold months that you need gas. So that's how Russia often leverages its position. So Russia started cutting gas on Ukraine, then later on Nord Stream 1. So that goes to Germany, and then we had the explosion on Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. And we can talk about what I think about that. There are different ideas floating around, some less believable than others, but yeah, we kind of seen that availability of gas kind of being cut down. Now, it's what I kind of talk about and put into a more theoretical framework, or kind of it's the way Russia uses geopolitics or uses energy as geopolitical tool is not straightforward, but it's almost like a textbook type of way. So it uses its power when some country is dependent on it for energy or for transit, for example, like Ukraine also. And uses what we call petro-carrots and petro-sticks, right? So Russia, and that's kind of includes Ukraine, right? So Russia would provide to Ukraine cheap gas and transit fees, and would allow Ukraine to accumulate debt. And Russia depended somewhat on Ukraine for transit, which it tried to actually avoid by building Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, as well as Turkish Stream, which probably could completely replace Ukrainian transit. And this was clear from the beginning. Russia has never built those new pipelines directly to Germany or Turkey to add additional supply, which, economically that would be good, because if you have additional supply, the prices should be cheaper. But that was never the case. Russia specifically said that they want to avoid the unreliable Ukrainian transit, and that's how it was basically set up. So, and the issues. So we have these petro carrots that Russia provides, right? It's like, okay, we pay you transit fees, we will allow you not to pay for the gas you receive. Gas is gonna be cheap, but if you do something that we don't like, we will take away all these benefits. And so Russia did. It would cut flows of gas to Ukraine, usually end of winter, usually when Ukraine or other countries don't have anything in the storage. And it was not only about Ukraine. At some points, 2/3 of Russian gas would go through Ukraine to Europe. So it wasn't just the pressure on Ukraine, we won't give you gas. It was also the pressure that, look, Ukraine, if we don't give gas, Europe won't have it, and you're going to be blamed for it. Right? So it's very complicated kind of type of thinking, but it really has been the case. And this is why actually Ukraine hasn't been buying directly Russian gas since, I think, 2015. What Ukraine did is basically it was transiting that gas, but some of that gas will stay because that gas was sold from Russia, for example, to Germany or to Poland. And Ukraine would buy virtually that gas, so it would be just kept in Poland. So it was still Russian gas often, more than often than not physically. It's just that transactions were set up differently. Wanted to also show you why Russia could exploit exploit natural gas better also in Central Eastern Europe than in Western Europe. So when you see the pipeline net here, gas pipeline net, you see that there's this parallel pipelines on the east and this net of pipelines in the west. And this is why, and that's by design. Russia used the Soviet bloc as point of transit, but also would develop relation or kind of bring gas to those countries. But it didn't want those countries to be connected with each other because then they can balance each other and help each other. But that's not what Russia wanted. They wanted to make sure that these countries are dependent. So the experience of Western and Eastern Europe is very different, right? On the Western Europe, as I said, you have this cooperation. Even under Cold Wars, gas is coming without problems. When Soviet Union fell, and Russia had no direct way of politically influencing, Eastern Europe, that's when energy came to be. And that's when we see the issues with Ukraine. So one of the stops in gas, or kind of when Russia increased prices, was when Yanukovych wanted to make easier for the Ukrainians to cross the border with the EU. NATO has been always an issue. So it's been really kind of where Russia said, well, oh, you want to join NATO? Not a good idea. Your gas is going to be so expensive. So, and this is because these countries were not well connected to the West and were not well connected to each other. And when in the West, you had this network of pipelines connected also to LNG terminals, and that could help much better to balance. So Europe and EU gas policy, of course, Europe took notice when things started happening in Ukraine. The attitudes from the West and the East of Europe were different. The West say, well, we kind of, Ukraine seems to be unstable. Maybe better to kind of connect with the pipeline directly via Nord Streams and so on. That is a diversification after all, but diversification of routes, not diversification of supply. Whereas Central Eastern Europe is like, no, this is not a way to go. You really want to make sure that you have other supplies available. And that's why we actually have seen the development of interconnections between different Central European countries. So Czech and Germany, Slovakia, Poland, Czechs, Poland, Ukraine, Poland, Lithuania, as well as, and then we're between the Baltic countries, so Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and Finland actually as well, which is dangerously close to Russia, of course. And that's when we also saw that LNG terminals started coming up in those areas, because these countries said, well, we need to make sure that we have access to waterborne gas. So LNG terminal first in Klaipėda in Lithuania, shortly after in Poland in Świnoujście, and then right around the pandemic, it was Kirk in Croatia. So this helped actually tremendously, this development, because when the war started, because if not for that, this region would be really, really affected to much bigger extent. So countries like Lithuania and Estonia, they were 100% reliant on Russian gas. Bulgaria as well. Poland, to a good extent, had no other access. In the meantime, because of this development, when Russia, after invading Russia, said, well, we cannot, because of all the bank issues and cutting Russia off SWIFT program, we cannot accept your payments in euros. We have to get rubles. And most countries, there was the way that they kind of went ahead and they figured it out. But Poland and Bulgaria said, nope, we don't need you. Because, in particular, Bulgaria has a very small demand, so they were figuring out they would be able to access it from Greece at some point. But Poland was preparing to cut off Russian gas anyways in December 2022. They were almost prepared. And that's when you end up actually, with expanding the LNG terminal, but also new pipeline to Norway was built. It's called Baltic Pipe. So I think it's very important to remember, because we often forget that European Union has not been that unified in the way that it viewed energy geopolitics. It has been almost ignored in the West. Again, I said for different reasons, including the trust or the relation that was developed over the Cold War between those two. So, how much time do I have? Yep. So, sorry? 10 minutes? Okay, yeah. So, entering war in Ukraine, right? I'm kind of almost entered it already because we talked about it, but this changed a lot. It changed the place of geopolitics in the minds, particularly of Western Europe. It really brought to attention energy security issues, in a way that they have not been present in Western Europe since 1970s, truly. They have been present all the time on the East, because the countries kind of had different experiences and actually experienced the way that Russia has worked geopolitically through natural gas. So, well, as I've mentioned at the very beginning, Russia has deployed gas weapon, right, against Europe, but not only right up when the war started. Actually, it started much earlier. So when you look at this slide here, you see the drop in Russian supply in the 2020. Well, that was because of the pandemic. Nobody needed as much gas. We still needed to heat the houses, but industrial production was completely down, so it was just not needed. In addition, at that time, there was just so much of gas, including LNG, to go around the world that LNG was basically traded at zero. The LNG companies were asking people to bring it back, or there was, I think at some point there were even negative numbers, so you basically had to pay to give somebody LNG, and part of it was because the storages were full, and it was that any type of storage was at a premium. So what Europe did, it actually refused some of the Russian gas based on the contracts. It's usually Europe could refuse 25% of the contracted volumes. That changed because the contracts actually became much more flexible over the years, because there was more competition in Western Europe in particular, and it would bring LNG. And that's why we see that drop in volumes that we see. The big drops that you see once in a while is actually maintenance on Nord Stream 1. So that's the 50 BCM. So when Europe, for comparison, Europe would bring, for a round number, around 200 BCM to Europe, including Turkey. 50 BCM was Nord Stream 1 that would go directly from Russia under the Baltic Sea to Germany. So when that maintenance happens, there's really a big drop. But you see the drop in 2020, and then kind of goes up a little bit in 2021, but keeps going down in 2021. And I'm not sure if you've paid attention, but there was a lot of, Europe was recovering from pandemic, needed more gas. Why is Russia not sending gas? And Russia said, well, we're sending gas. We're sending all gas that we contracted for. Well, we don't have any spot gas, meaning we don't have any extra gas to sell you on a market. We're just sending contracted gas. Not only were they not willing to send additional gas, they were also sending the contracted gas not from Russia. Russia has owned storage in Europe. Germany, Austria, and Netherlands, 3 countries where Russia owned storage. And it systematically would actually withdraw that stored gas and send it to European market over the summer of 2021. In summer, the storage is usually being filled, not withdrawn from. So systematically, Russia was just basically emptying that storage as winter was approaching, and some of the storage, in particular in Germany, was at, in November or October, was at 20%, where it normally would be at 80 or 90% of fill. So, and that created panic in Europe, because storage levels in Europe, storage levels in Europe became like really, really low, lower than the minimums. And I think the green one is where the storage level has been. So too low. And there was an issue of like, well, if we have cold winter, we might just not have enough gas. And Russia is not willing to send us more. So we can only count on those contracted volumes. And so that's kind of really what was already happening in 2021 before the shooting war began. And when the shooting war began, as I've mentioned, cut of gas through Ukraine, and then later the diminishing flows of gas through Nord Stream 1, to the point that at some point it was coming in at 40% and 20%, and then went into maintenance, came back at 20%, and then it exploded. Not on its own, it wasn't, but it did. And well, what happens when you have not enough availability? Not enough. Well, the prices go up, right? Again, as economists in the room could explain much better, forces of demand and supply are there, and the prices go through the roof. It's just not enough gas. And it's not like with oil, where Russia can send some of that oil that's being sanctioned to India and China and lots of countries and buy it at a discount, but they still can buy it. So globally, there is better and more balanced picture. Russian gas is stuck. If it cannot go to Europe, it cannot go anywhere. At least the one in Western Siberia. That's where the major fields are, where the developed fields are. It's not what some say, oh, Russia is just selling this gas to China. No. This is a completely different field where Russia sends gas to China. But this field, no, it can go nowhere else. Slightly, potentially, somewhat to Central Asia, but it's very little opportunity. So once of a sudden, this 150 to 200 BCM that was going to Europe was completely taken out of the market. Or almost completely. I think it's like now 10% of Russian gas goes to Europe, which created imbalance, because now where is Europe going to get this gas? We already know how many pipelines there is, so Norway is working overtime. What else is there? LNG. But as I mentioned, there is only limited amount of LNG that comes around. You just cannot bring more than there is available to sell, and you cannot bring more that your infrastructure allows, right? So accessibility became an issue too. You cannot access what's there because, well, there is not enough export infrastructure, but there's also not enough import infrastructure. Yeah. So in particular, you just don't have enough LNG terminals. Well, you kind of had enough, really, but you didn't have a way of connecting those markets. So the largest amount of LNG terminals is where? In Spain. Europe has a lot of capacity for LNG. That's in Spain. Around, I think, 80, we could calculate 80 BCM or so, meaning almost half that it would bring from Russia. There is no connection that can bring, there's a very tiny one to France, and that's it. There is no pipeline that could bring that LNG regasified all the way to Germany, for example. Right? At the same time, Germany had no LNG terminals itself, so you stuck. Even though you have the capacity, you're not able to transfer it, and where you need the most, like in Germany gas, you just don't have the facilities. You need to build them really, really quickly and really, really expensive. Go back. What happens when you have high prices? Well, this will affect industrial production, right? So probably everybody now knows that you have to save energy, right? Keep the home at a cooler temperature during the winter, and so on. But really what happened, those high prices really affected industry in Europe. And production, gas gas use fell around 15-17% on average, which is a lot, which is an issue because, and the EU is actually underscoring it now. Well, will Europe be experiencing deindustrialization? Will the companies move to different places? Because it seems like at the very least the prices of energy might be really volatile. Because of those high prices of energy, Gazprom still was making the same money in June of 2022 as it was making in June 2021. It was sending 1/4 of the gas and was making the same, or actually even probably a little bit more money than it did in 2021. So when somebody asks you, like, makes no sense for Gazprom, it did for a while, even commercial sense. Who stepped in? US LNG. It was the LNG that is most flexible on the market. And again, it's actually not the US LNG producers who are selling LNG to European utilities. And I cannot underscore it enough because this is what I have found where I have found a lot of misperception and a lot of blame kind of going around as, Americans are basically using the situation and are, making this amazing amount of money because look at the green is the price of gas in the US and the red is the price of gas in Europe. So there is a lot of money to be made, right? Well, not by the US LNG producers. Because what happens with US LNG, once it's produced, contracted, once it enters the LNG tanker, it actually is being sold at Henry Hub price, meaning at US price, plus liquefaction fee. So that's, the price was higher in the US, but nowhere close here, and that was how much, and it's usually the liquefaction fee that the LNG producers make. Now, other companies are buying it, and as soon as they have it on the ship, it belongs to them, and they can sell it anywhere. So it's destination flexible, as opposed to many countries that do not like it, including Qatar. So when they could send it anywhere, where do they send it? Well, to where it's more expensive. That was Europe. And that's what basically happened. And the companies are traders, like Transfigura and so on, or large aggregators, which means that there is oil and gas companies, large like BP, Shell, lots of them Europeans. China has made a lot of money on LNG in general. They have a lot of contracted LNG under zero COVID policy. They did not need it. They bought it at contracted prices that were either linked to oil or were linked to Henry Hub in US. I mean, the prices were much lower, and they made a huge profit on redirecting those volumes that they didn't need to Europe. So there is a lot of, but I think there is a lot of misconceptions because everybody thinks, well, the US LNG is being sent here. That's what we are getting. It's not indirectly. There's a third party involved. US LNG, what happened is it has been working at overtime, just like Norway, producing overcapacity. EU LNG terminals were working over capacity, trying to bring in as much as possible, and even though there was some limitations, as I mentioned, and you see that towards the end, you see US LNG is the largest source of LNG in Europe. This comes actually from a paper that we wrote, my colleague and I wrote in 2018, suggesting what should be done to make sure that Europe has a better energy security set. And that's where we where we say, well, US actually could and should get involved and support buildup of terminals, LNG terminals there, because it could help, or connections, because it could help energy security in Europe and Europe not depending on Russia. We wrote it actually in 2018, suggesting actually the investment. Currently, US is planning on spending money to build gas infrastructure or energy infrastructure in Ukraine and Moldova. So things are moving different place because now these countries actually have to figure things out, but so on. So I'll stop here. This is the storage story is, that's why I left it towards the end, because now it's really full, right? The warm winter really helped. Europe is feeling much better, not only about this winter, but hopefully for the next winter. But there are still a lot of uncertainties. One biggest one is truly the weather. If for some reason we have a really cold end of winter or a long cold end of winter, the storage could deplete. And then Europe will be faced with issue of filling it back in with zero Russian gas. Remember, last year, until June, the gas flow from Russia had been much better supply and was still flowing until September at a higher level. There is nothing now to reach for. And now this needs to be brought from other places, LNG, and as I've mentioned, there is no new LNG supply coming in this year. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Brilliant lecture, many ideas, and good analytical level. Excellent. Now, time to questions, comments, brief, concrete. If you want to express any idea, comment, question. Y se puede, al fondo primero y un momento.
Hi, thank you very much for this information. My question is, do you think the Green Deal had something to do with this and the green policies that adopted the European Union in the last years? Thank you very much.
I don't. It depends. Well, with what? Did it have anything to do with the Russian invasion? I don't think so. Again, I think it's been the Russian invasion has been based on the goals different than energy goals. Energy has been used for advancement of Russian goals. It didn't advance them as much as Russia wanted, thankfully. The countries really were brought together, including the U.S. leadership, on how to set up an alliance and help Ukraine. So I think in that way Russia failed. But I don't think the Green Deal kind of, made Putin consider the war rather than not.
Thank you.
Next question here.
Well, for me, I will say how this new...
Commander, please, a moment. The microphone is coming.
Thank you for your explanation, clear, but I would like to know if the new energies, the green energies, as he said, is going to balance better our energy balance, our European energy balance, so we do not depend on Russia or other countries, not only, we are thinking of Algeria or whatever, provide us with these sources of energy, as gas or oil. How do you see the future?
Yes,
and midterm.
Right. Well, that's the thing. The last word is the key. What's the short term? What's the midterm? And what's the long term? I keep hearing, in the short term we will just use a little bit of coal because that's available domestically, right? I don't know how short this short term will be. So I have here, the coal increase in Europe because gas became too expensive. Now, Germany is building a new lignite mine. How short-term that can be, right? And that's one part of the story. I think what happened with the invasion, sometimes I'm being asked, well, did it affect the energy transition? Will it make more likely, for energy to transition to green energy that is available domestically, and I get back to that. Or will it more likely for us to use coal or other resources? I'm thinking, well, probably all of the above. What it did, it focused on energy security and each country's needs and each country's comparative advantage. So what we will see is each country considering what will bring the most energy security for them. And some countries are better situated for renewable energy than others, right? So in Spain, probably solar makes sense. Poland, not so much. Or Germany, not so much, even though there is huge amount of kind of solar energy coming in or capacity coming in. So I think it will depend on each country. But I also want to say that, well, first of all, this energy is still cannot replace the traditional energy because it's intermittent, and we still have no way of fixing it. Technologically, we're not there yet. The best batteries can keep grid up for 4 hours. If you want to have industrial production, industrial development, that will be tough, right? And these are the best batteries that Western Europe can afford. Think about all the other places in the world. That will be very difficult. And the first thing I want to say, yes, the energy is produced at home, right? So at the very least, you cannot cut the access right away, like Russia would cut access to gas right away. But the aspects or element of the infrastructure that's being set up are not produced at home. Yes, we are switching now to building solar panels that are dominated by China to Europe and the US. Yes, that will take time, but that's doable. But there is issue of critical minerals and rare earths that are crucial for development of electrolyzers. Actually, electrolyzers use rare earths. So heat pumps, right? Also heat pumps, you end up with this issue. But and in addition, that critical minerals are either mostly owned or in China, or they owned by China in other countries. And China literally not only produces them, but also processes actually almost like 90% of that thing. That's a problem, because we are trading one dependency for another. Different type of dependency, but if you think that all your system is working on batteries, solar, wind, and so on, it's not like you don't need that all the time. You have to keep replacing. So it is still a flow of minerals and materials, steel, and so on, right? So yeah, you can help, and I think in Europe will move to much more renewables and kind of helping each other, nuclear in countries particularly that don't have like enough solar or wind, and so you will see that. But consider this: Europe is throwing a lot of money at the problem. A lot of money comes around. We're developing a lot of renewable infrastructure. Great. What does it do to global markets? It increases demand based on subsidies. Often in places like putting solar in Poland really makes no sense. The capacity factor is like 10%. Same with Germany. So you're using a lot of infrastructure build-up, a lot of money, steel, materials, critical minerals, and so on, to build something that's not very efficient. Right? You increase demand for those materials based on subsidies because there is a lot of money. What does it do to prices globally? It increases them. The countries that are not as wealthy are even now less likely to be able to afford it. And which part of the world is growing the most? It's not Europe and it's not the US. Where energy use is growing the most? It's not Europe and it's not the US. It's specifically Asia, but also increasingly we'll see this in Africa and so on. So these countries where energy will grow the most might be out of market because they won't be able to afford it. They cannot subsidize these. So if energy transition is, I guess the question is for Europe, what is energy transition for Europe? Is it energy transition of Europe? And then that means that the issue is comparative advantage because Europe doesn't have gas and oil that it can develop in a commercial way for many reasons. And so renewable energy and expanding it actually makes sense competitively. So if that's the case, that's competitive advantage. But if this is part of, decarbonization. Decarbonization is global and it might mean that other countries won't decarbonize. So there is a point of thinking how our actions here actually impact the world globally, and whether actually at the end you end up with unintended consequences, they will be more negative. But there is a positive though there, because Europe will have to think about use of this coal and stuff for a while, but at the same time there are strong decarbonization targets within the EU. So countries that now have money will be thinking, how can we address those emissions that we have to be producing because we have no other way? And we will see more push for technology, for example, for carbon capture and storage. If this technology gets developed by countries that have a lot of wealth and it can be scaled up, then the countries that don't have it as much wealth are able to actually use it. So there are ways in which we can actually think about the positives that the situation could create, as bad as the situation currently is.
Thank you so much. Any other question?
Hello. Thank you for this presentation. And my question is, based on the history of cutoffs of Russian gas in Ukraine, and based on the war in Donbass and annexation of Crimea Peninsula, could the war be predicted in February of last year?
Actually, the interesting part is, as I said, my colleagues and I, and my colleagues are much more knowledgeable in that, we did not think the war will start before, like literally the day before. So I'm thinking, not based on my own knowledge, but based on the knowledge of my colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania, who really work in that area, that it was hard to predict. That being said, Biden administration was warning around 2 weeks before the war that this could be an issue. We were just discounting it because it seemed not rational. It's just that the rationality, because, because the rationality of the war that Putin has waged is very different than what we think is rational. So, and it's unpredictable in many ways.
Thank you. Next question, please. The microphone there.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. Even if we all know that it might not be the best solution, couldn't it be a solution a short and mid-term using nuclear power?
So yes, probably also in the long term. If you want to decarbonize and have stable access to energy, that's what we have right now, nuclear power. But it takes a long time to build a new power plant. But there are actually plans, and in fact, Ukraine has plans to develop a new nuclear reactor with Westinghouse in the west part. Poland has signed a contract with Westinghouse to build a power plant, a nuclear power plant that would start working in 2033. So think about it, they signed it in 2022, it won't start until 2033. Takes a while, and I think in the history of nuclear power development, only one power plant was built on time. So that's probably a very generous, that might actually take longer. So that's that. Politically, nuclear power is unwelcomed in Germany in a way that I cannot fathom why, beyond the fact that there has been a very politically charged Green Party kind of push against it since 1970s, and it has become really, really strong after Fukushima. That's why by law, Germany had to stop nuclear power completely end of last year. They extended it to April this year, and they are saying they will not actually extend it further. Because it's against their policy and against their what they call Energiewende, or the change in energy. But I have a suspicion, however, That what's happening in Germany is not only that. And that relates to also where the nuclear fuel is coming from. Because as I've mentioned, oil and gas would come from Russia. Also, a lot of coal was imported from Russia. And nuclear fuel, that is still being imported to countries like Hungary from Russia. Actually, they've airlifted the nuclear power rods to bring it to Hungary. And that's an issue in Germany because their nuclear reactors ran mostly on Russian nuclear fuel. If Germany wanted to completely shut down nuclear, there was no reason for Germany to have additional nuclear fuel in stock. Currently, you cannot get nuclear fuel anywhere unless you have to order them, and it's going to be another 3 years till you're able to get it. They're just in short supply. It's not. So my suspicion is that the reason why Germany is not extending nuclear power more generation is actually that they don't have access to enough fuel. And in fact, actually, it makes no sense. They've extended nuclear power not as a base load, so meaning not that it works all the time, but they extended it just in case we will turn it on. Makes no sense, but again, it points to the fact to me that they probably just don't have enough nuclear fuel.
Thank you. Any other final question? Where, please, the hand.
Well, hi. Thank you very much for everything. It has been great. I was very curious about everything. So I want to ask you about your personal opinion, because what will happen when the Russian war with Ukraine finishes? Are we going to continue with the supplies of US LNG, or we are going to move to renewable sources? Or, for example, we are going to find other suppliers like Algeria, because in Spain we have pipes with them, so yeah. I was curious about that.
Well, many things depend on how war with Ukraine and Russia will end, right? Why will it end? Who will win? And so on. I think there's going to be in Europe. There's going to be a lot of renewable development. So, and part of it is because there has been the realization if we cannot produce it at home, we are really kind of have to rely on others. U.S. LNG is probably going to be here for a while. However, the issue, as I've mentioned at the very beginning, is the European companies are relatively unwilling to sign longer-term contracts for natural gas, for LNG, with U.S. producers. Actually, China is signing contracts, long-term contracts, all the time, including for U.S. LNG. And so, which basically makes me think that Europe will try to buy on spot, meaning on the market as it goes, which can become very expensive. So it's unclear, really. I think that the political hope is that there's going to be, either technological breakthrough or ability to set things up in a way that you end up with a lot of not only biofuels, but also biofuels, hydrogen, right? You end up with nuclear. France is focusing on nuclear because that's its traditional kind of setup for electricity generation. But again, I think in the meantime, there's going to be a lot of ad hoc purchases of gas, which again can be expensive. There's going to be a lot of coal that's being burned. And I don't know, again, how short will the short term be, because it will go beyond the conflict, very likely.
Thank you. The other question?
Okay, thank you very much. And last question, so we can let you enjoy Alicante. And my question was about how Europe can, not be conditioned geopolitically in the short mid-term, because we have the LGM, is coming from US, and on the other hand, we were conditioned by the natural gas of Russia. So, as the Russian gas was less expensive, how can Europe, in the short mid-term, if, as my colleague said, the war stops, what Europe should be? Sign the contract long-term with the US, LNG or stay with Russia as a historical partner and keep that historical partnership with Russia?
So currently there is very little gas that comes from Gazprom via pipeline, like 5% or 10% of what Russia used to send. And it's mostly through Ukrainian transit, tiny bit, and then a Turkish stream to Turkey and then further out to Southern Europe. There's actually Russian LNG coming into Europe, and that has grown. That includes mostly Novatek, which is I always love private Russian company. But it's coming in. Now, I can tell you why the U.S. LNG is a very interesting option for Europe. And that also goes to the type of contracts, as I've mentioned, that those very flexible contracts that you sign with the U.S. LNG producers. They're very different than the contracts, again, with Russian companies or with Qatar companies, where they want the destination clause, especially Qataris. Qataris have been fighting with Europe for that. They don't want their gas to be resold. They want their LNG to come where it's supposed to be and use there, period. And don't trade it, because Europe actually did it a couple of times where they traded the contracted LNG that was cheaper, and then they just sold it at a high price, and Qataris didn't like it. They took them to Europe to court. So that's one. This is not the case for U.S. U.S. just sells it at a price that's in the U.S., and you can do with it whatever you want, which means that if truly Europe in 2030 will not need it anymore, it can still sell it everywhere else. Those companies can still sign a 20-year contract and can sell that LNG to Asia in particular, because Asia will need it for many decades to come, and other countries as well. When you look at even the most kind of rosy scenarios, natural gas is still being used sometimes almost to the same extent as it is now in 2050. In fact, there's going to be still some coal going around, very likely. Transition is hard, and part of what will be impacting its infrastructure. But to go back to your question, there should be a good realization what the LNG contracts with U.S. offer, and that flexibility makes it actually a perfect tool for what Europe wants to achieve. So yes, Europeans putting those floating terminals, they actually they renting them for 10 years or so, and thinking that they might not need it anymore in 10 years. But they can still sign a long-term contract, and they have no obligation to bring it here to Europe. They can sell it on the market.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Time only for one question. We have a break. Any question? The last one. Political science question.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the conference. I think it was perfect, and it was really clarifying. And thank you for Professor San Martin for working it out. My question was a really quick question. It was about the 4 A's. You were talking about the 4 A's, and I was wondering the acceptability, no?
Oh, yeah,
I think it's the most political, maybe, no? It's like the more political thing, no? Maybe the other ones were more infrastructure, the other ones were more economic, and maybe if you could tell us something about that.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I usually actually get it, and I've missed that. Yes, so acceptability of natural gas, and that actually has changed quite significantly. So before the invasion, Russian gas was acceptable, right? It was considered, particularly in Germany, as a transition fuel where Germany phases out nuclear and coal. And that Russian gas was acceptable, considered cheap, not acceptable where was coal, for example, right? And that's based on policy, based on the Green New Deal and the policy of decarbonization. We have it flipped now, right? So Russian gas is completely unacceptable, whereas coal became acceptable because you just need it to survive. energy security has become prominent and kind of taking over the issues of decarbonization. And that's actually, I think, a good realization on part of Europe. And it's because many, also, I think, for the climate goals. It seems almost like, weird, but why? Because, as I've mentioned, it's not Europe and it's not the US that's going to grow economically. They just already are so developed that it's just hard to grow much more, right? In fact, some of the energy might be decreasing because you're more efficient. So they're not going to grow as much. Other countries will. And these countries have, if you just pay attention to different COPs, those developing countries are coming, it's like, we need energy. This energy security is important for us because we have to develop. We need to make sure that we have access to energy so we can develop our industry, we can make sure that our people do not live in poverty, that they have lights and so on. Now, renewable energy is great, but we cannot develop industry on renewable energy. So what else we can have? We can have fossil fuels. It's usually coal that they're using because coal, as opposed to natural gas and oil, is distributed geographically in more countries. So it's often actually a domestic fuel that allows you energy security. Not only this, but also gives you a lot of jobs, right? So that's another reason why it's so hard to get rid of it. But that realization that for Europeans, for the developed world, that energy security is important, will help them in the dialogue between them and the developing countries. I think there is something to be said about kind of experiencing what people, around the world experience on a daily basis. And the other thing is that, while Europe was preparing for potential, energy crisis this winter, was, just getting ready, and that never happened, thankfully. But it did never happen because Europe had enough wealth. It could buy the energy at very high prices. And this was not what other countries were able to do. So the gas that was actually going to Pakistan or Bangladesh, contracted gas, was sold by those traders back to Europe. They were okay with paying a fine, because they still were making money on it. And Pakistan and Bangladesh or India and Vietnam had no way of bidding out the Europeans. So when Europeans are thinking about, we just keep buying on the free market and we just, sometimes we're just going to pay more, they also have to think about how they're affecting others. And Pakistan has been going through a true crisis, energy crisis. If you just look at what's been happening there, and blackouts, lack of access to energy, actual energy shortage. So again, I think thinking global, not only regional, is very important. And understanding other viewpoints is crucial for not only to make the world more secure from the energy standpoint, but also to meet our decarbonization goals, or to actually decarbonize as opposed to meet goals regionally.
Thank you so much, and congratulations. Brilliant argumentation, analytical level, high note, extraordinary, absolutely. You are a gift of God, as it's impressive, the quality of this session. Thank you so much, and really we are very grateful to all of you. And thank you also to the Department of Security of the University of Alicante. Thank you so much for your great and extraordinary service. Good night, good morning.